He was a single dad barely keeping his restaurant alive, until one quiet customer picked up a tray and changed his life forever. What Carlos didn't know was that the woman helping him wash dishes was actually a billionaire CEO in disguise. What happened next shocked the entire town. The lunch rush at the overwhelmed plate always felt like a storm that never quite passed. The air buzzed with the sound of sizzling pans, clinking plates, and the sharp hiss of oil meeting flame. A dozen conversations overlapped in the small dining room where mismatched chairs and chipped tables stood like survivors of time. At the center of the chaos was Carlos, a 30-something single father whose every movement seemed like a battle between exhaustion and determination. His worn white apron was dotted with sauce stains and coffee splashes. His dark hair stuck to his forehead with sweat as he darted from one table to another, balancing trays heavy with plates while shouting quick thank yous to customers. His smile never left his face, but his eyes told a different story, one of a man running on fumes, trying desperately to keep his dream alive. Behind the counter, his 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, sat on a small stool with her feet swinging back and forth, clutching her sketchbook. Her curly brown hair caught the warm light streaming in through the window as she colored, occasionally glancing up to flash her father a proud smile. For Carlos, that tiny smile was the only thing that kept him standing upright through the chaos of every day. The restaurant was a family dream, something he and his late wife, Elena, had built together with little money and a lot of hope. But after she passed away, the place became less of a dream and more of a lifeline. Every meal served meant keeping the lights on. Every tip meant another week of school supplies or groceries for Sophia. There were days when Carlos wanted to give up, to sell the place and start over. But every time he saw his daughter coloring quietly in that corner, he remembered why he couldn't. The overwhelmed plate wasn't just a restaurant, it was all they had left of her mother's memory. Still, the reality was harsh. The fridge made a strange rattling sound that hinted at its final days. The stove took forever to light, and the peeling wallpaper seemed to echo the tiredness in Carlos's bones. He had lost 2 waiters in the past month because he couldn't afford to pay them on time, leaving him to do nearly everything himself: chef, server, cashier, and janitor. That afternoon, just when the noise peaked, the front door swung open, and a new face stepped in. Eleanor, dressed casually in a crisp white blouse and faded jeans, carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Her short blonde hair framed her face neatly, and her blue eyes scanned the restaurant like a seasoned observer. She smiled politely as she took a seat near the window, glancing around at the decor, family photos on the wall, a child's drawing taped near the register, and a faded homemade happiness sign above the kitchen door. To most, it looked like a struggling diner barely holding on. But to Eleanor, it looked like something else entirely. A story, a heartbeat of resilience, the kind of place where dreams and desperation met halfway. Carlos hurried over, wiping his hands on a towel. "Welcome to the overwhelmed plate," he said, catching his breath. "Sorry if it's a bit crazy today. Short-staffed again." Eleanor laughed softly, her voice calm. "Crazy means people love your food," she said, studying him with an expression that seemed to notice everything. The tremor in his hands, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he looked toward his daughter before every sentence. She ordered a simple meal, a bowl of soup and a sandwich, but she watched more than she ate. She saw how Carlos greeted every customer by name, how he apologized when orders took too long, how he smiled even when the stress showed in every line on his face. At one point, a plate slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The restaurant fell silent for a second before Carlos forced a smile. "Guess I'm adding dishwashing duty to my resume," he joked weakly, kneeling to clean up the mess. From her seat, Eleanor's instinct twitched. She had managed billion-dollar operations, built franchises, and trained executives. But what she was watching now humbled her. It was the purest form of leadership she'd ever seen: service, sacrifice, and heart. Yet she also saw inefficiency, burnout, and the quiet desperation of a man drowning in his own workload. Part of her wanted to step in, but she reminded herself she was here to observe, not interfere. At least, not yet. Meanwhile, Sophia climbed off her stool and tiptoed toward her father, placing a little drawing on the counter. It was a crayon sketch of their restaurant, with her and her dad smiling under a sun that looked too big for the sky. "For you, Papa," she said softly. Carlos paused, his exhaustion melting for a moment. "Gracias, mi amor," he whispered, tucking the paper into his apron pocket before returning to the chaos. Eleanor's gaze softened. She could tell this wasn't just another business. This was a man trying to keep a promise to someone who wasn't there anymore. As the lunch rush began to fade, Carlos finally found a moment to breathe. He leaned against the counter, wiping his forehead, when Eleanor approached to pay her bill. "The soup was wonderful," she said sincerely. "You have something special here." He chuckled tiredly. "Special, huh? Feels more like barely surviving." "Sometimes surviving is the first step to something greater," she replied, her tone hinting at a depth he didn't quite understand. He gave a polite nod and handed her the change, but she noticed his hands shaking slightly from fatigue. "You ever get help around here?" she asked casually. "Used to," he sighed. "Now it's just me, my kid, and whoever the universe sends my way." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then maybe the universe sent me for lunch for a reason." With that, she turned and walked out, the little bell over the door jingling behind her. Carlos stood there a moment, puzzled by the odd kindness in her tone. He looked at the receipt and noticed she'd left a tip 3 times the bill. But what struck him most wasn't the money. It was the handwritten note on the napkin she left behind. "You're doing great. Don't give up." That night, after closing, Carlos sat alone in the quiet restaurant. Sophia slept on the booth seat, her sketchbook half open beside her. He looked around the room. The scuffed floors, the flickering sign, the smell of cooked onions still hanging in the air, and thought about the stranger's words. "Don't give up." It sounded simple, but to a man standing on the edge, it felt like a lifeline. He didn't know who that woman was or why she cared, but something in her eyes reminded him of Elena's. The same calm belief that things could still get better. He turned off the lights, carried Sophia to the car, and locked the door behind him. Outside, the neon sign buzzed weakly against the night, half of it flickering out. But for the first time in a long while, Carlos felt a spark inside that refused to die. Somewhere deep down, he sensed that today wasn't just another hard day, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. The next morning began with the same sound Carlos had grown to both dread and depend on. The metallic clatter of pots and pans, the low hum of the refrigerator, and Sophia's soft humming as she set out napkins on the empty tables. The restaurant felt calmer before the storm of the lunch rush, but even that calm carried its own weight. Bills were stacked beside the cash register, like silent reminders of failure waiting to happen. The morning light spilled through the windows, warming the old wooden floors that had seen better days. Carlos stood behind the counter, eyes fixed on a list of overdue invoices pinned to the wall. He rubbed his neck, trying to loosen the tightness there, and muttered, "One more week, just one more week of full tables, and we'll catch up." But deep down, he knew he'd said the same thing last week, and the one before that. Still, he refused to let Sophia see that doubt. When she twirled by with her little yellow dress and that beaming smile, he forced one right back, because her faith in him was the one thing he couldn't afford to break. By the time the clock struck 11, the first customers had started to trickle in, familiar faces from the neighborhood, people who knew him, pitied him, or just liked the comfort of his cooking. The sizzle of eggs on the skillet filled the air, mingling with the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon pancakes. But as the tables filled and the orders piled up, the rhythm started to slip. One of the stoves flickered and refused to light. A waiter called in sick, and a delivery was delayed. Within minutes, the easy morning calm turned into a whirlwind. "Table 4 needs their order redone," shouted the young kitchen helper from behind the counter. "I'm on it," Carlos replied, spinning around, his voice cracking slightly. He tried to keep the energy high, but the sweat already formed along his hairline. Sophia was in the corner coloring again, watching her father move like a storm. Her small voice tried to help. "Papa, I can take napkins to the tables." He smiled weakly between rushes. "Not today, mi amor. Too many people, okay? Stay safe." That's when the bell above the door chimed, and Eleanor walked in again. Her casual elegance seemed almost out of place amid the chaos. White blouse, neat jeans, and a calm presence that cut through the noise like sunlight through fog. She took the same window seat as before, observing. The energy of the room was manic. Waiters rushing, Carlos trying to be everywhere at once, the kitchen staff shouting over the hum of machines. Eleanor watched as one of the older customers raised his hand, waiting far too long for water. Then she saw Carlos trip slightly on his way back from the kitchen, balancing 2 plates at once, his apron already splattered. When he finally reached her table, he looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, but was trying not to show it. "You came back," he said with a surprised laugh, brushing his hand over the order pad. "The soup called me back," Eleanor said with a soft smile. "Looks like you could use another pair of hands." Carlos chuckled breathlessly, not catching her tone. "You wouldn't happen to have restaurant experience, would you?" "A little," she replied, eyes glinting. "Corporate dining, mostly." Before he could respond, a crash echoed from behind them. A tray had fallen. The youngest waiter had dropped 2 full glasses of juice, and the floor was slick. Carlos groaned under his breath, already halfway there with a rag. But Eleanor was faster. She stepped forward, kneeling to help mop the spill, her movements quick and practiced. "Hey, wait, ma'am, you don't have to—" "Relax," she said, looking up at him with a reassuring smile. "I'm not made of glass," Carlos blinked, thrown off by her composure. Most customers would have been annoyed or left. Instead, she was helping him clean. Within moments, the floor was dry again, the customer reassured, and the flow of the restaurant resumed. Eleanor didn't return to her seat right away. She noticed empty glasses, stacked dishes, and the overwhelmed kitchen assistant trying to find clean plates. Without being asked, she picked up a tray, refilled water glasses, and cleared a few tables. Her movements were efficient, deliberate. Not like a random helper, but like someone who understood restaurant rhythm instinctively. At first, Carlos was too busy to stop her. But when he finally did, he stood frozen, holding a stack of menus. "You really don't have to do that," he said, half embarrassed, half grateful. "I know," Eleanor replied simply, wiping down a table. "But sometimes, helping a good person feels better than sitting still." For a second, he had no words. He just looked at her, this stranger blending into his chaos with a kind of effortless grace. Then he smiled. "Okay," he said finally, "but you at least get free coffee for life after this." She laughed. "I'll take one now. Black, please." The afternoon drifted into something different after that. The tension eased a little, laughter returned to the tables, and even the overworked kitchen felt lighter. Customers began to notice the mysterious woman helping the owner. Some thought she was a new hire. Others assumed she was family. Eleanor carried herself with such quiet authority that no one questioned it. She joked with Sophia, complimented the food, and offered small, gentle suggestions to Carlos when things got hectic, like where to place the water station, or how to organize the orders to avoid confusion. He listened, realizing each idea made surprising sense. When the rush finally faded, Carlos leaned against the counter, exhaling deeply. "You're a miracle, you know that?" he said, looking at her across the room as she placed the last glass back on a shelf. "Just a customer who hates seeing good people drown," she said softly. "You must have been a manager or something," he teased. "Something like that," she replied with a small grin that he couldn't quite read. As the evening light dimmed, Sophia approached Eleanor with her sketchbook. "You helped my daddy a lot today," she said shyly, holding out a drawing she'd made, a simple picture of the restaurant with Eleanor smiling next to Carlos behind the counter. Eleanor took it gently, touched in a way she didn't expect. "This is beautiful, sweetheart." "I'll keep it," she said, her voice catching slightly. Carlos came over, drying his hands. "She doesn't usually draw new people that fast," he said quietly. "Guess you made an impression." Eleanor smiled down at Sophia. "Your dad's a superhero. I just carried the cape for a minute." They shared a soft laugh, the kind that feels like a sigh after a long day. As the sky outside turned orange, Eleanor finished her coffee and stood to leave. "You'll see me again," she said. Carlos looked genuinely puzzled. "You planning on working here full-time now?" "Let's just say," she said, slipping her sunglasses on as the bell chimed above the door, "I like being where good people try hard." After she left, Carlos stood there staring at the door for a long while, her words echoing in his mind. There was something about her, something confident, almost commanding, beneath the kindness, but he couldn't place it. He turned to Sophia, who was yawning against the counter. "You think Miss Ellie's coming back tomorrow?" Sophia smiled sleepily. "She said she would, and when nice people say something, they mean it." Carlos chuckled and dimmed the lights. Outside, the street lamps began to glow, casting long shadows through the restaurant windows. He looked at the stack of clean plates, the wiped tables, the calm that had settled in place of chaos. For the first time in months, the overwhelmed plate felt manageable, and though he didn't know it yet, the woman who'd walked in that day wasn't just a customer. She was the spark that would soon turn his entire life upside down. Over the next few weeks, the overwhelmed plate slowly began to change. Not in appearance at first, but in rhythm, in tone, in the invisible energy that fills a place when something good begins to stir. Every morning, the little bell above the restaurant door jingled, and without fail, Eleanor stepped in with her usual calm grace. She always dressed simply: jeans, a light blouse, sometimes a blazer, but carried herself with a quiet authority that even Carlos, in all his exhaustion, had started to notice. She would order her coffee, roll up her sleeves, and before Carlos could stop her, she'd be helping again. One morning, she reorganized the condiment shelf without being asked. Another day, she showed Carlos how to arrange plates for faster service. Her presence became so natural that the regulars began to ask if she was his business partner. "Something like that," Carlos would reply, smiling faintly. But the truth was, he didn't know what she was. She was kind, sure, but there was something beneath that kindness, a confidence, an awareness, a polish, that didn't quite fit with her just helping out story. Sophia, of course, adored her. The little girl followed Eleanor around like a shadow, clutching her sketchbook and peppering her with questions about everything, from how she tied her hair so perfectly to why her handwriting looked like the people on TV. Sometimes Eleanor would sit with her between rushes, teaching her to fold napkins into swans or draw menus with bright markers. They laughed together so much that customers often mistook them for family. To Sophia, Miss Ellie was just another grown-up who loved her dad's pancakes. But to Carlos, she was becoming something he hadn't expected, a source of peace. He'd begun to notice how she read people. When customers seemed impatient, she'd strike up a conversation that diffused their irritation. When a new waitress froze under pressure, Eleanor would step in, guiding her calmly. One day, Carlos caught her quietly fixing the restaurant's chalkboard menu out front, adjusting the wording to something catchier. "Made with love, just like home." That night, they sold out of the soup special for the first time in months. "You've got a gift," Carlos said, wiping down a table as they closed. Eleanor smiled. "No gift, just experience." I used to work around restaurants a lot. Must have been some fancy place, he teased. She laughed softly, stirring her coffee. Something like that. He didn't press her. He didn't want to. Her help felt like a blessing, and the last thing he wanted was to chase it away with questions. What mattered was that things were finally turning around. Yet, as the days grew busier, Eleanor saw what others couldn't, the toll it was taking on him. His hands trembled from overwork, his eyes were rimmed with fatigue, and he rarely sat down to eat a full meal. Every night, after closing, he would walk Sophia home, carrying her on his shoulder because she always fell asleep on the counter waiting for him. Eleanor began to worry, though she hid it behind her easy smile. There was something noble but heartbreaking about his resilience. He was trying to carry too much, alone. One evening, as a light rain pattered outside, the restaurant was quieter than usual. The golden light from the lamps cast long, soft shadows across the tables. Sophia sat drawing at her usual spot, while Eleanor and Carlos shared a rare moment of calm at the counter. "You know," Eleanor said, tapping her fingers on her coffee cup, "you've built something special here, Carlos. But special doesn't mean it has to be this hard." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Tell that to my landlord, my supplier, and the tax office." "I mean it," she said gently. "You're doing everything yourself. Kitchen, service, finances. You ever think of getting some help?" "I can barely pay the bills, Ellie. Hiring help isn't exactly an option." "Then maybe it's time to think differently," she said, leaning forward. "You've got the heart, but you need systems, small fixes that can make big differences." Carlos frowned slightly. "Systems?" "Yeah," she said, her voice calm but deliberate. "Like organizing prep lists, labeling storage by use frequency, rotating menus based on cost efficiency, things that make the work flow smarter, not harder." He blinked. "You sound like you've done this before." She smiled but didn't answer. "Let's just say I've seen enough to know how to keep a kitchen alive." He didn't realize it, but she'd been quietly taking notes during her visits. Inventory counts, food waste, customer turnover, and even local foot traffic patterns. Her brain worked like a business map, calculating possibilities. But she wasn't here to take over. She wanted him to find his strength again. That night, they worked side by side, rearranging shelves and redesigning the small kitchen flow. By closing time, the place looked no different from the outside, but for Carlos, it felt new. Everything had order, direction, purpose. "Feels like I'm breathing for the first time," he admitted, locking up. "I haven't seen the counter this clean in weeks." Eleanor grinned. Sometimes success starts with space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Over the next few days, her influence spread quietly. She taught him simple marketing tricks, like offering free soup samples to passers-by, or posting Sophia's drawings online with the caption, "Made by our littlest manager." It worked. New faces began showing up, drawn by the charm and warmth that the restaurant suddenly radiated. Sophia was delighted. "Papa, look! More people are coming because of my art," she squealed one afternoon as the bell jingled again and again. Carlos couldn't stop smiling. For once, the future didn't look like a dark tunnel. It looked like light breaking through. And every time he looked at Eleanor, gratitude swelled inside him, though it came with confusion. Who was she really? Why did she care so much about a struggling single father's restaurant? He thought about asking her directly, but couldn't bring himself to. There was trust between them now, an unspoken bond that didn't need questions to exist. As for Eleanor, she found herself unexpectedly drawn to this world she'd tried to leave behind. The corporate halls she ruled felt so far away from this place of burnt toast, laughter, and second chances. Every time she saw Carlos wipe his brow and smile at a customer, she was reminded of something she'd lost long ago: purpose that wasn't measured in profits. One evening, when Sophia handed her a napkin folded into a paper heart with the words, "Thank you, Miss Ellie," Eleanor had to look away for a moment, blinking back the sting in her eyes. That night, after Sophia had fallen asleep in the corner booth, Carlos and Eleanor shared coffee at the counter again. The lights were dim, the restaurant quiet, except for the hum of the fridge. "You know," he said softly, "if you ever need a job, I can't pay much, but you'd be the best hire I ever made." She laughed, shaking her head. "I already have a job, Carlos." "Oh, yeah? Doing what?" Eleanor paused, stirring her coffee slowly, the spoon clinking gently against the cup. "Helping people," she said finally, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something in her voice, something that hinted at a truth deeper than he realized. She smiled then, breaking the silence. "You've got this, you know. You just needed a little nudge." Carlos leaned back, looking around the restaurant that had once felt like a prison and now felt like hope. "You've done more than that," he said quietly. "You've made me believe this place can be alive again." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her expression soft but unreadable. "It already is, Carlos. It just needed someone to see it." As she left that night, the rain had stopped. The moonlight caught on the sign above the door, and for the first time in years, it didn't flicker. It glowed steady and bright, like a promise. Carlos watched her walk away through the window, a strange feeling rising in his chest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid to find out. The morning began beautifully, almost deceptively so, with sunlight pouring through the front windows of the overwhelmed plate, and the scent of fresh bread drifting through the air. For once, the world felt kind. Carlos moved easily behind the counter, smiling as he flipped pancakes and hummed along to the old Spanish songs playing from the kitchen radio. Sophia sat near the window, drawing yet another picture of their restaurant. This one brighter, happier than the rest, filled with smiling customers and a big sun overhead. Eleanor had already been there for an hour, casually sipping coffee while working through invoices with that same calm focus that always impressed him. They'd become a team now, the rhythm of their days almost effortless. She had started calling the place their little miracle. And Carlos found himself starting to believe it. The regulars noticed the difference. The food seemed warmer, the service smoother, and laughter filled corners that once held silence. For the first time in a long time, Carlos felt like they might actually make it. But as anyone who's ever stood at the edge of hope knows, the storm often hits when the sun shines brightest. It happened just before the lunch rush. The air conditioning unit sputtered once, twice, then went completely dead. Within minutes, the kitchen grew hot, unbearably hot. The fridge began to hum like it was gasping for air. The lights flickered, and suddenly the entire restaurant went dark. Every sound stopped. A few customers murmured in confusion. Others fanned themselves with menus. Carlos froze for a split second, the ladle slipping from his hand and splattering soup across the floor. His heart dropped. He knew that sound. He knew what came next. He dashed into the back, yanking open the electrical panel, praying for a miracle. Nothing. Total power failure. "Not now. Please not now," he muttered, slamming his palm against the side of the metal box. Sophia peeked in nervously. "Papa?" He turned, forcing a shaky smile. "It's okay, baby. Just a little problem. Go sit down, yeah?" But the panic in his voice betrayed him. Within minutes, the food started to spoil. The kitchen grew unbearable, and the customers began leaving one by one. Carlos tried everything: unplugging, replugging, flipping switches. But it was no use. When he finally emerged from the kitchen, his face was drenched in sweat and defeat. "I'm sorry, everyone," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "We're having some technical issues. Lunch will be on the house today." The words tasted like failure. Eleanor had been watching silently from her corner. She stood now, calm as ever, but her eyes carried a sharpness Carlos hadn't seen before. She looked around, assessing everything: the dim lights, the melting ice, the smell of food spoiling, like a soldier scanning a battlefield. Then she walked straight toward him. "Carlos," she said evenly, "how long has the wiring been acting up?" He rubbed his temples. "A few weeks. The electrician wanted a deposit before he'd even look at it. I thought I could stretch it another month." "Okay," she said, voice steady. "Don't worry. We'll handle this." He laughed bitterly. "Handle this? The fridge is dying, the lights are out, and the food's going bad. I can't afford another disaster, Ellie. I'm done. Maybe it's time to close it down before it kills me." He turned away, gripping the counter, shoulders shaking. It was the first time she'd seen him crumble like that. The man who'd faced every setback with a smile now looked hollow, defeated. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're not done," she said softly. "You're just tired. Let me help." "Help?" he scoffed. "You've done enough. You don't need to fix everything for me. This is my mess." Her tone hardened slightly, not unkindly, but with a quiet authority that made him look up. "Carlos, let me handle this." Before he could respond, she was already on her phone. Her voice changed, lower, firmer, with a command that carried weight. "Yes, this is Eleanor Grace. I need a full repair team and generator at 217 Maple Street, immediately. Priority response. Charge it to the corporate account. I'll handle approvals personally." Carlos blinked. He'd never heard her speak like that. Crisp, decisive, almost intimidating. She hung up without waiting for a reply and met his stunned gaze. "They'll be here in 30 minutes, she said simply. He frowned. "Wait, what? Who did you just call? How do you even know people like that?" Eleanor exhaled quietly, then reached into her purse and pulled out a sleek black business card. Thick paper, embossed letters that shimmered faintly under the emergency light. She handed it to him without a word. He read it slowly, his brow furrowing. "Eleanor Grace, Chief Executive Officer. Grace Hospitality Group." For a long moment, he just stared. Then he looked up, eyes wide. "You're a CEO?" His voice cracked between disbelief and confusion. "A CEO of Grace Hospitality? The company that owns half the city's restaurants? You're serious?" Eleanor gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I wanted to see what real service felt like again. I started out as a waitress before any of this, and somewhere along the line, I lost touch with what mattered. When I walked into your place, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Heart. And I couldn't walk away." Carlos's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His mind spun with 1,000 thoughts. The woman who'd been refilling glasses and folding napkins beside him was one of the most powerful people in the industry. "Why would someone like you waste time here?" he asked finally. "Because this," she said, gesturing to the dim, messy restaurant, "is where real stories live. Real passion. And because you reminded me why I fell in love with this business in the first place." Just then, a van pulled up outside. Within minutes, technicians and electricians poured in, setting up equipment, replacing wiring, and installing a temporary generator. Customers who had left began returning out of curiosity, watching as the lights flickered back to life. Sophia clapped excitedly when the air conditioning kicked in again. Carlos stood there, overwhelmed. Eleanor moved through the chaos like a conductor, coordinating every detail effortlessly. "Replace the condenser unit first." "Yes, I'll approve the charge directly. And send an order for a backup freezer. This man's food deserves better than melting ice." Carlos watched her in awe. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time. The calm, commanding energy of a woman who built empires but cared enough to fix one struggling diner. When the team finally left and the restaurant hummed with new life, He turned to her. "I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," she replied with a small smile. "Just cook. The rest, I'll handle." That evening, as the neon sign outside buzzed steadily again, customers filled the tables, talking, laughing, unaware of how close the place had come to dying. Carlos stood behind the counter, ladle in hand, tears pricking his eyes as he watched Sophia serve cookies to a family with pure joy. He turned toward Eleanor, who was quietly reviewing receipts near the register. "I think I owe you my life," he said softly. Eleanor looked up, her blue eyes reflecting the warm glow of the lights. "No," she said gently. "You owe yourself a little faith." Outside, the rain had stopped, and a thin rainbow curved across the dusk sky. For the first time in months, the overwhelmed plate felt alive again, not just as a business, but as a heartbeat restored. And for Carlos, the woman who had once seemed like a miracle now stood revealed as something even greater, a guardian in disguise. He didn't yet know how far she intended to take this, or what it would cost her. But as he looked around at the thriving tables, he realized one simple truth. Sometimes angels don't come with wings. Sometimes they wear blouses, sip black coffee, and carry business cards that change lives. The night after the power crisis, the overwhelmed plate glowed with a kind of warmth that couldn't be explained by the newly installed lights or the humming equipment. It was deeper than that, a warmth born of gratitude, disbelief, and the faint tremor of something about to change forever. The storm outside had passed, but inside Carlos still felt shaken. He kept looking at the black business card resting on the counter, its silver letters catching the light. Eleanor Grace, CEO, Grace Hospitality Group. He must have read it 20 times since she handed it to him, and still, it didn't feel real. How could the woman who'd been folding napkins beside his daughter be one of the most powerful figures in the restaurant world? It didn't fit. It didn't make sense. But as he looked over at her now, sleeves rolled up, calmly sorting invoices, Sophia sitting beside her drawing, he realized maybe it didn't have to make sense. Maybe some people just appeared in your life to remind you that miracles didn't always come wrapped in logic. Sometimes they walked through your door wearing jeans and a quiet smile. The restaurant was closed to customers that evening. After the chaos of the past 2 days, Carlos had decided they all needed a break. He made a simple dinner for them: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and a small salad. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. The three of them sat together at the same table where Sophia usually colored, the flickering candle between them casting long shadows across the freshly cleaned floor. For a while, they just ate in silence, the kind of silence that feels comforting rather than awkward. Finally, Carlos looked up. "So," he began softly, "how long were you planning on keeping it a secret?" Eleanor set her fork down gently. "Honestly, I didn't plan any of this," she said. "When I first walked in here, I just wanted lunch. I was tired. Tired of meetings, tired of titles, tired of hearing numbers instead of stories. And then I saw you, running this place like it was the world's last ship in a storm, holding everything together by sheer will." She smiled faintly. "I couldn't just sit and eat my soup and leave. Not when I saw what you were trying to protect." Carlos let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "Protect, huh? I'm not sure I've done a great job at that. You saw the state this place was in." She tilted her head. "I saw a man doing everything in his power for his daughter. That's not failure, Carlos. That's love." Her words hit something deep inside him. He tried to reply, but the lump in his throat made it impossible. Sophia, blissfully unaware of the heaviness in the air, offered Eleanor a cookie she'd been saving. "Miss Ellie," she said proudly, "Papa's cooking is the best in the world." Eleanor smiled and took the cookie. "I think you're right, sweetheart. And with a little help, the whole world might get to know it, too." Carlos frowned slightly, curiosity mixing with fear. "What do you mean, a little help?" Eleanor leaned forward, her tone shifting to that quiet confidence he'd heard on the phone the day before. "Carlos, I've been where you are. When I was younger, my father owned a small diner. Just like this. We worked day and night. But when he got sick, the business collapsed. Nobody helped us. I promised myself that if I ever had the power to change that for someone else, I would." "You reminded me of him." Carlos's expression softened. "You lost him?" She nodded slowly. "Cancer. I was 23. I watched everything he built disappear. The bank took the building. But the memories, the laughter, the smell of coffee in the morning, those stayed. That's what built Grace Hospitality. Every restaurant I opened, every deal I made, it all started because I wanted to give people what he gave me. A place that felt like home." For a long moment, the only sound was the soft crackle of the candle flame. Carlos swallowed hard. "So what now? You swoop in, buy the place, put your logo on the sign, and turn it into some shiny franchise?" Eleanor's eyes lifted sharply, hurt flashing there. "No," she said quietly but firmly. "That's not what I'm here for. I didn't come to take this from you. I came to give you a chance to make it stronger. On your terms." He studied her, still guarded. "You mean like, invest?" She nodded. "I'll cover the equipment costs, fix what's broken, and help you streamline operations. No contracts, no takeovers, just mentorship and support. You keep full ownership. I just want to see you, and Sophia, safe." He leaned back, stunned. "You'd do that? For me? Why?" Eleanor smiled softly, looking down at the little drawing Sophia had left on the table. The three of them standing in front of the overwhelmed plate under a bright sun. "Because sometimes the universe gives us reminders," she said. "You reminded me of what matters. And helping you reminds me who I am." Carlos didn't respond right away. His heart ached with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. All his life, he'd been the one helping others. Employees, neighbors, anyone in need. He never expected someone to return that kindness, let alone someone like her. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "Then don't," Eleanor said gently. "Just let me help." The next morning she arrived earlier than usual. But this time she wasn't alone. A team of designers, suppliers, and consultants from her company followed behind her, their vans unloading equipment and tools. The staff stood outside in shock as the crew started working like a well-oiled machine, installing new lighting, repainting the faded walls, and repairing broken shelves. Carlos stood frozen at the doorway, completely overwhelmed. "Eleanor, this is too much," she smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning." For hours, the restaurant buzzed with activity. Sophia ran around excitedly, handing out lemonade to workers, proudly announcing, "My dad's restaurant is getting a makeover." Customers walking by stopped to watch, some cheering, others filming. By sunset, the overwhelmed plate looked like a completely new place. Cleaner, brighter, alive. The old flickering sign had been replaced with one that gleamed gold under the evening sky, though Eleanor had insisted on keeping the name exactly as it was. "It tells your story," she'd said. "And that's what makes it special." When the crew finally left and silence returned, Carlos stood in the middle of the dining room, staring at the transformation. He turned to Eleanor, eyes glistening. "You really did all this. You didn't just save my restaurant. You gave me hope again." Eleanor smiled softly, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You did this, Carlos. You just needed someone to remind you that you could." He wanted to hug her but stopped himself. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you. For everything. For believing in us." Her gaze softened. "You don't owe me thanks. Just promise me one thing. When someone else needs a hand one day, you'll remember this moment." "I will," he said quietly. "I swear I will." That night, after Sophia fell asleep on one of the booths again, Carlos sat alone in the newly renovated restaurant, the warm lights casting golden reflections on the glass windows. He thought about the past few months, the struggle, the exhaustion, the loneliness. And then about her, how she walked into his life as a stranger and somehow became the reason everything changed. He looked at the business card once more, but this time it didn't intimidate him. It inspired him. Outside, the streets were calm, the city lights twinkling like a promise. And as Eleanor walked past the window on her way to her car, she glanced back just once, her expression soft and proud. Their eyes met through the glass, a silent understanding passing between them. Something beyond business, beyond gratitude. It was respect. It was connection. Carlos smiled to himself. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in his fight. He had an ally, someone who had seen his struggle and decided he was worth saving. The world could call her a CEO, but to him, she'd always be something else entirely. The stranger who carried a storm into his life, only to leave behind sunlight. The following weeks brought a transformation to the overwhelmed plate that felt almost unreal. Every morning, when Carlos unlocked the door, the air inside seemed lighter, no longer heavy with worry and fatigue, but alive with the scent of freshly baked bread, hope, and possibility. The once faded walls now glowed in soft amber hues, decorated with hand-painted accents that reflected warmth and familiarity. The new kitchen equipment gleamed under bright lights, and the old, sputtering refrigerator had been replaced by a state-of-the-art system that hummed smoothly. For the first time since he'd opened the restaurant, Carlos didn't start his day by worrying about what would go wrong. Instead, he thought about what could go right. And much of that was because of Eleanor. Every day she arrived before sunrise, often bringing coffee for the small staff. She'd trade her elegant blazers for an apron and roll up her sleeves, jumping into the heart of operations as if she were born for it. Her presence was magnetic. She had this rare ability to make everyone around her believe in themselves. The cooks began taking pride in every dish, the waiters smiled with genuine enthusiasm, and even customers could feel that something special was happening. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about family, about resilience, about second chances. And at the center of it all stood Carlos, his shoulders finally lifted from the invisible weight that had burdened him for so long. Eleanor's guidance wasn't just managerial, it was transformational. She began teaching Carlos the principles of efficient business management, how to budget properly, how to price dishes without losing profit, how to track inventory and reduce waste. At first, the spreadsheets and cost sheets intimidated him, but she explained them with patience, breaking everything down in simple terms. "You've been doing all the hard parts already," she told him one afternoon as they sat together at the counter, Sophia doodling nearby. "Now, I'm just showing you how to make the work for you." She also introduced subtle but impactful changes to the menu. "People don't just eat food," she explained. "They eat stories. Every dish should have one." Together, they reimagined the offerings, turning Elena's old recipes into signature specials. The sunrise pancakes, named after Sophia's cheerful drawings of morning suns, became the restaurant's new bestseller. Locals loved the story behind it. A father and daughter finding light after loss. Soon, photos of the pancakes began appearing on social media, and word spread fast. One weekend, a local food blogger stopped by, intrigued by the buzz. His review titled, "From Chaos to Comfort, the Magic of the Overwhelmed Plate," went viral in the small community. Overnight, their reservation list filled up for the first time ever. Carlos couldn't believe it. "We have a waiting list," he said, staring at the book with wide eyes, as if afraid it would disappear. Eleanor laughed. "Told you, people love authenticity. You just needed the world to see it." Under Eleanor's mentorship, the staff began to grow as well. Carlos rehired one of his old waiters who had quit months before, and this time the man returned smiling, eager to be part of something new. The energy in the place was contagious. Even Sophia took on little responsibilities, refilling salt shakers, greeting customers, and showing them her sketches proudly. She had her own little name tag now, assistant manager, in training. Everyone adored her. But perhaps the biggest change was in Carlos himself. Gone was the constant tension in his eyes, the weary slouch of a man fighting an endless battle. He now walked with confidence, cracked jokes with customers, and even took moments to breathe. Real, peaceful moments. Eleanor noticed this quietly, never drawing attention to it, but the pride in her eyes spoke volumes. Watching him flourish gave her a joy she hadn't felt in years. In helping him rebuild his dream, she'd rediscovered her own. One evening, after closing, they stood together outside the restaurant under the warm glow of the new sign. The letters shone steady and golden against the dark sky. The overwhelmed plate. Carlos wiped his hands on his apron and turned to her. "You know," he said softly, "when you first came here, I thought the universe sent me an angel. But turns out, it sent me a teacher." Eleanor chuckled, crossing her arms. "I don't know about that. You did all the hard work." "Maybe," he said, glancing through the window where Sophia's drawings now framed the counter. "But you reminded me why I started this in the first place. Before you, this place was just survival. Now, it feels like life again." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of distant traffic blending with the soft hum of the neon sign. Finally, Eleanor said, "You've built something that matters, Carlos. Not just for you, but for everyone who walks through those doors. That's real success." He looked at her curiously. "You talk about it like it's not yours, too." Eleanor smiled, but her gaze drifted toward the horizon. "This was always yours," she said. "I was just lucky enough to witness it." As the days went by, the restaurant became something of a local legend. News outlets picked up the story. "Single Dad's Restaurant Saved by Mystery Investor." And though Eleanor's name was mentioned briefly, she always shifted the spotlight back to Carlos. "It's his heart that saved this place, not me," she'd tell reporters. She refused to let the narrative turn into another corporate rescue story. This wasn't about business. It was about humanity. One particularly busy Saturday, the restaurant was packed wall to wall. Families laughed over plates of food, couples took selfies under the new decor, and Sophia darted between tables with the enthusiasm of someone twice her size. Carlos was at the grill, moving with precision and joy, while Eleanor helped the hostess seat a new family. As she looked around, she felt a lump rise in her throat. Every corner of the restaurant pulsed with life. The laughter, the smell of sizzling garlic, the hum of music. It all reminded her of her father's old diner. Long gone, but somehow reborn here, after closing that night, Carlos found her sitting alone at one of the booths, gazing out the window at the quiet street. "You okay?" he asked softly, sliding into the seat across from her. She smiled faintly. "Yeah, just thinking. This place, it's special. You've created something rare." "You helped me create it," he said. She looked down at the cup of coffee between her hands. "Maybe, but this," she gestured around them, "is why I do what I do. Not for the board meetings, not for the numbers, for this feeling." Carlos studied her for a moment. "You know, you don't have to go back to that world if you don't want to." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Oh, I do. I have a company to run, people to answer to." "Yeah, but you could stay a little longer," he said, half joking, half hopeful. She met his eyes and smiled in that quiet, knowing way that always left him speechless. "Maybe I will," she whispered. In the following days, their bond deepened beyond simple partnership. They laughed more, shared stories late into the night after Sophia fell asleep, and leaned on each other in ways neither expected. It wasn't romance yet. It was something purer, built on shared struggle and respect. A kind of connection that didn't need words to exist. As spring settled in, the overwhelmed plate stood as a testament to what resilience and kindness could build together. Customers often said they could feel something different when they ate there, like every dish carried a story, every smile carried meaning. And though Carlos never took full credit, he knew that behind every success was the woman who'd walked in one day, ordered soup, and quietly turned his whole world around. Late one night, as he cleaned up and Sophia slept curled up in a booth, Carlos looked around the restaurant, the glowing lights, the spotless counters, the framed drawings, the laughter still echoing faintly in the air, and whispered a silent thank you, not just to Eleanor, but to fate itself, because somehow, through all the chaos and hardship, life had given him not just a second chance at his dream, but a friend who had turned that dream into something real. And as he locked the door and stepped outside, the sign above flickered once, then steadied, glowing brighter than ever, as if to say the tide had truly turned. Morning sunlight spilled softly through the windows of the overwhelmed plate, wrapping the little restaurant in a golden glow that made it look almost ethereal. The bell over the door chimed every few minutes as regulars and new customers streamed in, laughing, chatting, and filling the air with a kind of warmth that had once felt impossible. The tables were never empty now. The smell of coffee, pancakes, and fresh herbs mixed with the hum of conversation, creating a melody of life that seemed to play from every corner. Carlos moved through it all like a conductor, calm, confident, smiling. His white apron was spotless, his hands steady, his laughter genuine. There was a lightness in his step, one that hadn't been there before. The man who once ran himself ragged just to keep the lights on now managed his dream with purpose. And through it all, Eleanor was there. No longer the undercover stranger, but something even more important. A friend, a mentor, and the silent heartbeat of everything that had changed. Every morning, she would sit by the window with her coffee, reviewing notes or chatting with customers as if she'd always belonged there. But even in her ease, there was reflection behind her eyes. A quiet sense of awe at how much the place, and the people in it, had transformed. She watched Carlos joke with his staff, watched Sophia skip around the tables delivering napkins and laughter, and realized something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the kind bought by success or luxury, but the kind that comes from connection. It wasn't long before word spread far beyond the neighborhood. Local journalists, influencers, and even television reporters began to take interest. The little restaurant that could, they called it. But the story wasn't about renovation or investment. It was about people, about a widowed father who refused to quit, and the mysterious woman who believed in him when no one else did. Though Eleanor's identity as a CEO eventually became known, the public loved her humility. They called her the heart behind the apron, and the name stuck. The day the first news crew arrived, Carlos panicked. "I don't know what to say to cameras," he admitted, nervously fixing his collar. Eleanor laughed softly and handed him a towel. "Just speak from the heart," she said. "It's what got you this far." And he did. He told them about his wife's dream, about the nights he almost gave up, and how a stranger's kindness changed everything. His voice wavered at times, but his honesty captured everyone who heard it. When the interview aired that night, the restaurant's phone rang non-stop with reservations. Messages poured in from people saying his story gave them hope. For Carlos, it was surreal. He looked around the crowded dining room one evening, the laughter, the glow, the smell of food, and whispered to himself, "We did it, mi amor. We finally did it." For Eleanor, the transformation was just as personal, though she rarely spoke of it. In the quiet moments, after Sophia had gone to sleep, after the last customer left, she'd sit alone in the corner booth and stare at the flickering reflections of lights on the window. In those moments, she'd think about the boardrooms, the sterile offices, the cold metrics of success that had once defined her, and she realized how hollow they seemed now. She had spent years chasing numbers, but here, in this tiny place run by a single father and his little girl, she'd rediscovered the heartbeat behind her entire industry. Here, she saw what business was supposed to mean: people, community, belonging. One evening, after closing, she found Carlos on the rooftop above the restaurant, sitting on a crate and staring at the city lights. Sophia had fallen asleep downstairs again, her head resting on her sketchbook. Eleanor climbed up quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "I figured you'd still be up," she said, handing him one. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, his voice thoughtful. "Every time I close my eyes, I keep thinking this might all disappear. Like I'll wake up, and it'll all be gone." Eleanor smiled, sitting beside him. "It's not going anywhere, Carlos. You built this." He took a long sip, his eyes distant. "I built it, yeah, but you brought it back to life." She turned to him, her expression soft. "Maybe, but you would have found a way. You always do." They sat in silence for a while, the city stretching beneath them like a field of stars. A cool breeze brushed through the air, and the neon sign below flickered faintly, that familiar glow of the overwhelmed plate. "You know," he said finally, "you could have just written a check, fixed everything, and left. Why'd you stay?" Eleanor looked down at the glowing sign and thought carefully before answering. "Because I didn't come here to save you, Carlos. I came here to remember myself." He frowned slightly, not understanding. "I'd forgotten what it meant to feel the work I do," she continued. "I built an empire, but somewhere along the way, I lost touch with the people who make it all possible. You reminded me why I started. This place, your story. It's changed me more than you know." Carlos stared at her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met in a silence that said everything words couldn't. Gratitude, admiration, and something deeper. Something that neither dared name. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Then maybe we both saved each other," he said softly. Eleanor smiled, the faintest shimmer of emotion crossing her face. "Maybe we did." The weeks that followed only deepened their bond. They began working like true partners, planning small community events, hosting charity dinners, and inviting local students to learn about running a business. The restaurant became more than a place to eat. It became a hub of kindness, a beacon for the community. People from all walks of life gathered there. Single mothers, veterans, young dreamers, elderly couples. And every night, the place pulsed with life, laughter, and stories. One afternoon, Eleanor surprised Sophia with a gift. A little chef's coat embroidered with her name. "For the youngest manager in town," she said with a grin. Sophia squealed and hugged her tightly. "Miss Ellie, when I grow up, I want to be just like you." Eleanor's eyes softened, but something inside her cracked open. No one had ever said those words to her before. Not with that kind of innocence, that kind of love. "I think you'll be even better," she whispered. Later that day, as she watched Carlos twirl Sophia playfully behind the counter, Eleanor felt tears well up in her eyes. This was the kind of legacy she'd always wanted. Not skyscrapers or mergers or headlines, but this: joy, life, love, continuity. She realized that the success of the overwhelmed plate wasn't just about saving a business. It was about restoring humanity, one act of kindness at a time. That night, the 3 of them ate dinner together after closing, laughing over stories from the day. Sophia fell asleep mid-laugh, her tiny hands still clutching a cookie. Carlos gently lifted her and laid her on a booth seat. When he turned back, Eleanor was staring at the empty tables, her eyes lost in thought. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Just thinking about how far we've come." He smiled. "You're part of that we, you know." Eleanor's lips curved into a soft smile, though her gaze lingered on the glowing sign outside. "I know, I just don't want to lose this feeling." As they stepped outside, the night was quiet, except for the soft chirp of crickets and the hum of streetlights. The sign above them bathed them in golden light, the words, "The overwhelmed plate," shining bright against the darkness. Carlos looked at it, then at her. "Whatever happens next," he said, "you'll always have a home here." Eleanor didn't reply right away. She just looked at him, her expression caught somewhere between joy and sorrow. The kind of look someone gives when they know a chapter of their life is nearing its end, even if they're not ready for it. Finally, she smiled faintly and whispered, "And you'll always have more strength than you think." They stood there in silence, side by side, watching the light glow steadily against the night sky. Two souls from different worlds, bound by one simple truth, that compassion, not success, was the real measure of greatness. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the city, it felt like the universe itself was smiling back at them, whispering that this moment, this bond, was what it all was meant for. Morning sunlight painted the front windows of the overwhelmed plate in golden streaks, and the familiar hum of life inside the restaurant carried a sense of fulfillment that words could barely describe. It had been 6 months since that fateful day when the lights went out, and Eleanor revealed who she truly was. In those months, everything had changed, not just for the restaurant, but for everyone whose lives were touched by it. The walls that once carried the scent of struggle now echoed with laughter. The menu, once a jumble of hastily written items, was now neatly printed with stories beside each dish, tiny notes about family, love, and second chances. Customers would pause, smile, and read before ordering. And more than once, someone would glance at Carlos and Sophia with teary eyes, as if reminded that hope could still bloom in the simplest places. Business was booming, but that wasn't what made Carlos happiest. What made his chest swell with pride was seeing Sophia run through the restaurant with her little apron, taking menus to tables, or standing on her tiptoes to hand change to a customer. She wasn't just growing up inside a restaurant. She was growing up inside a legacy. Eleanor had been spending less time there lately, but when she did come, the entire place seemed to glow brighter. She often arrived early in the mornings before the customers came in, sitting at her usual window seat with a cup of coffee, quietly watching the street come alive. Carlos would find her there, sometimes lost in thought, and they would share a silent smile. The kind of wordless connection that no title or contract could ever define. Their relationship had deepened into something sacred. Not romance, exactly, but something beyond friendship, built on respect, trust, and gratitude. She had given him the tools to rebuild, and in return, he had given her something far rarer: meaning. One late afternoon, when the golden light hit just right, Eleanor stood by the door watching the steady rhythm of the place. The chatter, the laughter, the clinking of cutlery. It was all music to her ears. Carlos approached, wiping his hands on a towel. "You're thinking about leaving," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. He had seen it in her eyes for weeks. That soft distance, that quiet awareness of unfinished duties somewhere beyond these walls. Eleanor hesitated, then smiled sadly. "I have to, Carlos. Grace Hospitality. It's still mine to run. I can't stay away forever." He nodded slowly, swallowing the heaviness in his throat. "I figured as much. You've given us so much. I just wish—" She interrupted gently. "Don't. This was never about giving, Carlos. It was about sharing. You gave me more than you know." He looked around the room, at the tables filled with people, at Sophia giggling with a group of regulars, at the glowing sign above the counter, and realized she was right. The restaurant wasn't just saved. It had become something living, breathing, independent. "Still," he said softly, "it won't be the same without you here every day." Eleanor's smile deepened. "That's the point. You don't need me here anymore." She looked toward Sophia, who was helping a young couple choose a dessert. "You've already built your future. And hers." That evening, after closing, they sat together one last time at the corner table. The restaurant was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of the wind outside. Sophia had fallen asleep in a booth again, clutching her sketchbook. Carlos poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Eleanor. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Coming here, getting involved with us? She shook her head slowly. No. All of this, is exactly what I needed. For years, I thought success meant expansion, control, influence. But then I watched you, Sophia, this little place, and I realized success is just making life better for someone else. She paused, tracing her finger along the rim of her cup. This restaurant reminded me that leadership isn't about power. It's about purpose. Carlos smiled, leaning back. Then I guess we both learned something. Eleanor chuckled softly. You learned how to manage inventory, and I learned how to be human again. Sounds like a fair trade, he said, and they both laughed quietly. The kind of laugh that carries both joy and sadness. A few days later, Eleanor hosted a small press event at the restaurant, not to celebrate her company, but to officially announce a new initiative inspired by Carlos's story, the Grace Foundation for Small Family Businesses. It was designed to provide struggling independent restaurants with mentorship, not money. Practical help, human help. Reporters filled the tiny space, taking photos of Carlos standing beside Eleanor and Sophia, who proudly wore her little manager's apron. This, Eleanor said during her speech, is what success looks like, not skyscrapers or profits, but people helping people. One act of kindness can change a life, and in turn, that life can change a community. The room erupted in applause, and Carlos felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked down at Sophia, who beamed up at him, whispering, She's talking about you, Papa. He smiled, placing his hand on her shoulder. No, mi amor, he whispered back. She's talking about all of us. The months that followed were filled with growth. The overwhelmed plate became a community landmark, the kind of place that everyone in town knew, not just for its food, but for its story. Photos of Carlos and Sophia hung on the wall near the entrance, alongside a framed article titled, Kindness on the Menu. Travelers passing through the city often stopped there just to see the place they'd read about. And though Eleanor's visits became rarer as her responsibilities grew, she never disappeared completely. Every now and then, she'd walk in quietly during an early morning rush, take her old seat, and smile as if no time had passed. Carlos would always greet her with the same words. Welcome home. One particularly beautiful morning, she arrived to find the restaurant bustling as usual. But something was different. The front sign now had an addition. In partnership with Grace Hospitality. Founded on hope. Carlos had added it as a surprise, not to give her credit, but to remind everyone of the power of unity. When she saw it, Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he replied. But I wanted everyone to remember that sometimes the greatest things start with a stranger's kindness. Later that day, after the last customer left, Sophia ran up to Eleanor holding a new drawing, the restaurant under a glowing sun, with her father, and Eleanor standing together in front of it. It's called A New Beginning, she said proudly. Eleanor took it in her hands, smiling through her tears. It's perfect, she whispered. You're an artist of happiness, Sophia. As the sun dipped low behind the city, casting golden light across the windows, Eleanor knew it was time to go. She stood at the door, taking one last look at the place that had changed her life. Carlos joined her quietly, hands in his apron pockets. You'll visit? He asked softly. Always, she said, her voice steady but warm. She hesitated, then added, Keep believing in people, Carlos. That's what keeps the world turning. And you, he replied. Keep reminding people what real leadership looks like. They exchanged a long look, a silent farewell, heavy with gratitude and unspoken emotion. Then Eleanor stepped out into the golden evening, the wind catching her hair as she walked away down the street. Inside, Carlos turned the sign from open to closed and stood for a moment watching her silhouette fade into the crowd. When he finally turned back, Sophia was standing in the doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Is Miss Ellie gone?" she asked. Carlos smiled gently, kneeling beside her. "Not really, sweetheart. She's everywhere in this place. In the lights, the smell of the food, the laughter. She's part of us now." Sophia nodded, holding his hand as they looked out at the glowing sign together. "Then we're never really alone," she said softly. "No, mi amor," Carlos whispered, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We're never alone." Outside, the city lights shimmered like scattered stars, and the neon sign of the overwhelmed plate glowed stronger than ever. Not as a symbol of a restaurant saved, but as a reminder of what happens when hearts choose compassion over convenience. It wasn't just the story of a single dad and a CEO anymore. It was a story of humanity, of how one act of kindness can ripple far beyond its beginning, turning ordinary lives into extraordinary legacies. And as the night settled gently around them, Carlos smiled at the stillness, knowing this wasn't the end at all. It was only, as Sophia had named it, a new beginning. Sometimes, the people who lift us up wear no capes. They just care enough to help. If this story touched your heart, remember, kindness changes everything. Subscribe to Drew Daily Stories for more powerful real-life moments that remind us humanity still wins.